Hello, everyone, and welcome to ASCD's EL Live. I'm your host for this episode, Stephanie Roth. I'm ASCD's publisher and managing director of content. As usual, we're staying healthy and safe and coming to you from Adam's backyard. This episode, we're talking about trauma-sensitive schools. Creating safe, supportive spaces for kids and the educators that support them is certainly not a new idea. But the disruption and anxiety from the pandemic, political polarization, and the cumulative effects of racial injustice are creating an even greater demand for the practices that respond to the emotional needs of the students we teach. We're here to help with some words of wisdom from Micere Keels, the director of the Trauma Responsive Educational Practices Project at the University of Chicago, and Paul Gorski, founder of the Equity Leadership Institute and Ed Change. But first, Ed Talk. You're talking, and we're listening. Viewers of our last episode loved what Cornelius Minor had to say about anti-racist grading. Tennille Shade tweeted, "Holy cow, this follow-up to EL Magazine's interview with @Mr. Minor is unbelievable. His tenacity to honor those who have been at the work for decades and to call out the damning effects of profitability in education is powerful stuff. Watch this." Christina Lavinia responded to Rick Wormley's September EL article, 7 Habits of Highly Effective Teachers, by tweeting, "I feel like I need to print this and hang it where I'll see it all day, every day." On Silver McTighe's Instructional Shifts to Support Deep Learning, Krista Lay tweeted, "Love the philosophy behind this. Set broad, essential questions that allow students to connect with the curriculum in a meaningful, relevant way. Inspire them to think deeply and see the connections in the world and among people. Keep the talking going and tell us about the work you're doing. Tweet @EL Magazine and @ASCD to make your voice heard." Now, here's ASCD's Naomi Tier with Micere Keels.
You talk in your article about the need for teachers to be more responsive to students who are traumatized and have behavior problems, responsive rather than reactive. Can you talk about what it would look like for a teacher to be reactive to a type of behavior versus being responsive?
Yes. And so we very specifically use responsive versus reactive to think about whether you are just being emotional in your reaction. So absolutely, students challenging behaviors creates emotional reactions in us as adults and as teachers. We are simply human. That is a natural aspect of being in interpersonal interactions, is to have emotional reactions. And when students challenge our authority, when students are quote unquote disobedient or obstinate, or when students are just behaving in ways that we find disrespectful, all of those things are going to create emotional reactions in us as adults. And when we are reactive, we are acting based on that emotion. And so when we ask educators to be responsive, we're asking them to not ignore their emotional reaction, because we're all human, but to get into the habit of pausing before responding and then thinking about, how do I make sure that the student leaves this interaction having learned something that will improve their behavior.
I noticed you mentioned in some of the training materials, teachers might even use some kind of internal calming mantra in the moment. Is that a strategy you've had teachers use, and what kind of mantra might they try?
Yes. So one of those mantras is literally repeatedly telling yourself, this is not about me. And that's really something that we try to get teachers to understand, is that when the behavior in the moment is not in line with what just happened, so all you did was ask the student to please, I'm going to need you to turn around, to stop talking with your neighbor, turn around and turn to page 28. And the student has an emotional outburst in response to that. That is not about you, and that is not about the current moment. Because it's when we take it personally that it's about me, that we then are much more reactive. But when we can say, this is not about me, something else is going on with the student, this is not about me, I need to find out what's happening, this is not about me, it helps you to be a little less emotionally reactive, and then kind of say, okay, So if this is not about me, I need to ask some questions. Like, what's going on? You seem upset. Has something happened? That then will allow me to get hopefully a little bit of information and insight into why you just blew up over me asking you to turn around.
Next, Paul Gorski talks to ASCD's Sarah McKibben.
What should trauma-informed education look like in a virtual setting?
Wow, that's a really great question. I mean, in essence, I think it kind of looks the same. For instance, this idea of accounting for structural injustice and the traumatic impacts of structural injustice. If I have a policy like students must leave their cameras on, then I'm really not accounting for that. There are students who might not want to, who might find it quite traumatizing to invite me or to have me come uninvited into their space through their cameras. I think that's sort of an example. I think a lot of the other examples are sort of the same in person as they are virtually, as accounting for the differences in people's experiences that come from trauma, especially the traumas of institutionalized or structural injustice and how that impacts children.
What should school leaders avoid when implementing trauma-informed programs?
Well, you know, I think the biggest problem there is trying to take an institutional culture as it exists and then layer trauma-informed practices on top of that. So, you know, I think they should avoid this approach where they're going to just sort of take a prefabricated framework and apply it when they haven't done the work institutionally for that to work. So, for instance, the schools and districts with which I've worked, schools and districts that start with a racial justice framework and then incorporate trauma-informed into that. The trauma-informed practices look very different. In schools that don't do that, the trauma-informed practices look like the same racist practices that existed before they applied trauma-informed. So I think, and I would say this for all of these kind of shiny new programs, the tendency to want to just sort of plop them into an institution like they are going to change the institutional culture by themselves. We have to change the institutional culture for the trauma-informed practices, you know, to work. You know, I think sort of avoiding that idea that this is going to solve the problems for us that it can't possibly solve.
That's it for this episode, but we'll be back next month talking about education in the early grades. In the meantime, get extended content on ASCD's YouTube page and our streaming video site, and look for the October issue of Educational Leadership. For ASCD, I'm Stephanie Roth. Thanks for joining us.